Hello, this is Professor Matt Miller, and I am back with another PowerPoint video for you. This is going to be a very brief introduction to jazz music. Now, it's impossible to do justice to a subject as rich and diverse as jazz music in the time I'm going to spend here, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try not to try your patience too much and keep this as brief as I can. So consider this Professor Miller's attempt at boiling jazz music down to 15 minutes or less. We'll see how well I do. I'm not so sure. I have a PowerPoint for you. I'm hoping for the best. It's a subject I'm really excited about, so hopefully that'll help things go well. All right, let's get started. Um, Jazz, where did it begin? Well, it's impossible to give an exact year when jazz began because it was a slow evolution. There was no cutoff point. There was no light switch that went off. There was no single person that invented it and said, hey, this is jazz. Instead, what happened was a slow evolution involving a lot of different kinds of music throughout the 19th century, and even before, really, but throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, when jazz started to become recognizable in the form that we're used to it today. Um, Jazz music was played first in America in New Orleans, where it was referred to as Dixie or Dixieland music, and it really began to take off in the 1920s, first with African American audiences, and later with other more mainstream audiences. Um, the earliest roots of jazz date back to African tribal music. In a sense, then, all jazz began when African rhythmic sensibilities were violently imported to the United States on slave ships. And because many slaves were prohibited from speaking, they were separated so that slaves from the same language cultures couldn't communicate. They often communicated through music. They used drums and just simple like patting their own bodies and rhythms to communicate messages. These are some of the earliest origins of jazz. Slaves communicating through instruments or through their own bodies, attempting to articulate themselves and the horrifying position that they found themselves in. But jazz progressed, and it evolved through a lot of different kinds of music. But I guess in a sense, you could say that jazz is the marriage of African rhythmic and melodic sensibility with certain innovations derived from Western music, especially Western instruments. So when African Americans discovered instruments like the tuba and the trombone and the clarinet, the saxophone, that's when jazz began. When Western instruments were put in the hands of people that could play with what was an essentially African sensibility, which is quite different than the European sensibility, which plays on what's known as a pentatonic scale, a fixed scale. Maybe you learned it in music school as a kid. Um, you know, when you play piano, or everything is tuned and you can play in key together. Well, African music is less melodic, more rhythmic. It involves enormously sophisticated and complex rhythms, much more complex than the rhythms of European classical music. When these complex, syncopated polyrhythms were merged with Western instruments, played on a pentatonic scale, but with variations that no Europeans had ever before thought of trying, jazz was essentially born. When did the word jazz begin to be used, and what does it mean? This is a hotly debated topic, but jazz as a phrase originally didn't refer to music. It referred to, the human spirit. It referred to things like spunk, spirit, chutzpah, pizzazz. It meant like a spirited performance, and it also had a sexual connotation. The first known published reference to jazz was in 1912, describing a baseball pitch by a minor league pitcher. This was surely, after many people had been using the term orally, as is often the case. That the publication comes after the oral use of a word. The application of jazz to music began in 1915 and accelerated throughout the late teens and into the 20s. In the beginning, there were various spellings of jazz, including J-A-Z and J-A-S-S. It was codified into a more recognizable and conventional word in the 20s. Where does jazz music come from? Well, we've already touched on this in a little bit. In a broad sense, jazz, as I said, is the merging of African and later African American sensibilities with Western instruments and song structures. A pop song based on Western folk music, involving three verses and three choruses, what we today would call pop music, essentially, was adopted by some African Americans who were playing for audiences in traveling shows, minstrel shows, oftentimes, and that started to be called jazz, especially when it involved brass instruments. Um, it comes to us via all these different, what you might call grassroots, DIY, I guess is the term today, musical forms, including the slave work song or shouts, gospel music, rural folk music, often played on stringed instruments, and later ragtime and the blues. It's a melting pot art form, merging many strands of folk music into a distinctive new sound. What's the difference between jazz and the blues? Well, historically the terms have been used interchangeably. Jazz and blues might have been more or less the same thing in the 20s and even into the 30s, but as time went on, the two forms of music became more distinct, and today musicologists distinguish between jazz and blues. Blues is a more specific form. It depends on a more fixed song structure. Although blues solos do involve improvisation, there's not quite as much improvisation or as wild of improvisation in blues music as there is in jazz music. Blues is also finds its roots in solo performances at first by African American men. Um, in fact, people would have their own personal blues. It'd be called a blues, for example. So and so is down on the dock playing his blues. It'd be known as so and so's blues, and it was usually a single African American playing on a stringed instrument, a guitar or banjo, and singing a song that usually had to do with some kind of suffering, and that's the earliest kinds of blues music, and that form was adapted into jazz. Jazz absorbed that like it has absorbed so many other things. So jazz is a more varied musical form than blues that includes the blues, especially when played on brass instruments. Early popular performers of jazz include Ma Rainey, whose life we'll be looking at through August Wilson's play Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, coming up soon, and Bessie Smith, who is mentioned in the play, among many others, also Billie Holiday, go on and on. And their music was both bluesy and jazzy. Blues played in a jazz idiom. So some of the first jazz superstars were women, a point reflected in the play we'll be reading in today's, in this section's module. What kind of instruments are used in jazz music? Well, many kinds, many kinds. But historically, jazz was often played on brass instruments like trombones, tubas, trumpets. Later, saxophones became the dominant instrument. Yet early jazz also used woodwind instruments like the clarinet, which for a while were not popular but have made a bit of a comeback in jazz music. Clarinets were huge in really early jazz, especially Dixieland jazz, and then once the saxophone took over, they weren't seen as being quite as hip or cool, and then they kind of re-emerged later. Also, some stringed instruments have been used in jazz. Early on, especially, the banjo was used as a rhythm instrument in a lot of early jazz. Later, the guitar, electric guitar, became a part of jazz. And soon enough, drums and other percussion instruments were also utilized. Once electric instruments became invented, jazz musicians were interested in them and did amazing things on the electric guitar and on the organ especially. Charlie Christian is, maybe the premier jazz electric guitar player if you're interested in his music on the electric guitar. Who listened to jazz? Who were the jazz audiences, and who listens to jazz now? Well, in the beginning, jazz was appreciated almost exclusively by African American audiences. Some white Americans took a kind of, modest interest in jazz. They thought of it as a kind of exotic thing, a primitive thing. It wasn't, of course. It was quite sophisticated. But soon, beginning in the 20s, jazz became more and more popular as a kind of edgy art form with some adventurous white audiences. White folks started going to places like Harlem and sitting in on jazz performances in some of the first mixed race audiences. Jazz also brought mixed race performances to the American stage for the first time. One of the first people to do that was the great Jewish jazz musician Benny Goodman, who was instrumental in breaking down racism through arranging performances that involved collaborations between white and black musicians. At first, this was scandalous, and there are all this outcry and turmoil and controversy about it. Slowly, it became accepted, and we owe a lot to folks like Benny Goodman as well as other musicians for bringing black and white musicians together and breaking down the boundaries of race. As more and more white audiences co-opted jazz, they often watered it down in orchestral arrangements that sounded more and more tepid to please middle-class white American ears. That type of music was resisted by black musicians, in particular by bebop musicians. Today, more white audiences than black audiences tend to listen to jazz. If you go to a jazz show in the Village today in New York, which I recommend, the Village Vanguard, one of the oldest and best jazz music venues, is right here in the city, in the West Village. You'll see a mixed audience to some extent, but it tends to be more white folks into jazz these days than black folks, usually college-educated white audiences. Of course, not exclusively, but it's kind of an interesting shift, I think, if you look at jazz historically. Jazz music still thrives in New York, Chicago, Paris, and other urban centers. It's definitely a living art form. It may not be as popular as Lady Gaga or Justin Bieber, but it's still pretty popular, and there's a lot of great jazz being made. I myself go attend as much live jazz as I possibly can. I've been seeing jazz shows all summer since school got out, and New York is just a great place to be if you love jazz. What are the different forms of jazz? Very quickly, early New Orleans jazz, often referred to as Dixieland or just Dixie. This was marching brass music as well as party music played in brothels and bars. It tended to be upbeat and ebullient, at least on the surface. There's a kind of core of sadness and suffering to it, but on the surface it was peppy. 20s era jazz gave birth to what is often called classic jazz, which often featured female vocalists and slower, more bluesy sounds. Then came swing music, which introduced a lot of dance to jazz. Later, big band music came about, and soon after that, bebop music became popular in the 50s, which revolutionized jazz, making it much more complex and ambitious. And what happened to jazz after that? Well, after the bebop revolution of the 50s and early 60s, which was a high watermark for jazz by anyone's standards, then came the post-bop and the free jazz era, which involved even more radical experimentation, diverging even more from fixed melodies, involving ever more adventurous and radical experimentation. Finally, well, not finally, subsequently after that came what we call fusion. The most famous fusion jazz album is an album by Miles Davis called Bitches Brew. Fusion is a 70s thing, especially a late 70s thing, a little bit in the 80s too. It was a merging of jazz with rock, rock, world music, psychedelia, disco, and other forms. Jazz, of course, also influenced rock and roll, R&B, and later rap and hip-hop. In fact, Miles Davis made a hip-hop album late in his career, just shortly before he died, called Amandala. Who are some of the prominent masters of jazz music? Well, there's just too many to do justice to here. So please, see my introduction in my introductory handout on jazz and the blues in the introductory section of the course. If you click on Introduction on our course and you look at the handouts down toward the bottom, there's one addressing jazz and blues music. And if you take a look at that, that'll introduce you to some of the best names. But to mention just a few, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Benny Goodman, Pee Wee Russell, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Keith Jarrett, and Ornette Coleman, all of whom are deceased Ornette Coleman just passed away, about a month ago or so. Um, some people considered him the last of the great jazz musicians, although I think there's still... Oh, actually, Keith Jarrett might still be alive. I'm not quite sure. I haven't heard any new music from him in a long time. So I'm not sure. Keith Jarrett might still be around. The rest of them have passed on. Where can I learn more about jazz music? Well, the internet's a great source. YouTube. I mean, seriously, try doing some YouTube searches for some of the names on the jazz handout or some of the names I just mentioned, and listen to this music for yourself. It's fabulous. I think you'll fall in love with it. At least some of you will. Pick around. Go with what appeals to you. If one of the names that I've listed, if that person's music doesn't appeal to you, forget about it. Move on to the next thing. There's a lot out there. Jazz is a diverse, rich, complex art form with at least some manifestation to please, I think, almost everybody. So there's just so much for free online on YouTube and on other streaming services that's a good place to start for the music. If you want to read more about jazz, I recommend starting with the book Blues People by Leroy Jones. That's Blues People by Leroy Jones. Just a great book. Written by a great African-American jazz critic. A good guidebook to cover individual albums in a more sort of like musician-by-musician basis is a book called The Guide to Classical Recorded Jazz by Tom Piazza. So those are two good places to start. I love talking about jazz. I hope some more of you. We didn't have folks showing up really to my last 8 o'clock session, but next Thursday I'll be up again, talking about jazz, talking about the play we're reading, talking about the class, and hoping some of you show up to talk about it with me. So be a good place to talk about jazz and whatever else. I'm going to leave it at that. Ma Rainey's Black Bottom introduces you to one of jazz's first major musicians attempting to record some of her music in a recording studio owned by white producers. And it's a fascinating play. I think you'll really love it. There's also some links in the course module to some music for you to listen to that you have to listen to, you're assigned to. By the way, I can tell when you listen and when you don't. I can see who listened to what, and I can see how long you listened. So if you quit listening to this video, I can tell when you do that. So you are required to listen to all this stuff. Please do so, okay? All right, that's it for jazz music. Hope you're having a great summer, and I am signing off.